My name is Dr. Lena Hart, and I've spent the last 22 years learning how to survive that part. I didn't become a doctor because I believed in miracles. I became one because I needed to believe I could matter, that I could fix something, anything. I came from a house where silence rotted the walls and no one said sorry. I knew early on that being needed felt safer than being loved. So I chased the hardest job I could find, medicine. The kind of medicine that strips you raw. I got accepted into one of the busiest trauma programs in the country, Chicago General. People called it the pit. The ER there eats young doctors alive. It never sleeps. It doesn't care if you cry. Doesn't care if you haven't eaten in 16 hours. Doesn't care if it's your third code of the night. It just keeps going. The first patient I ever lost was a 17-year-old girl. Blunt force trauma. She coded twice in the ambulance, came in pulseless. My attending cracked her chest, told me to find the aorta and cross-clamp. I hesitated. Just long enough. She bled out. My gloves were soaked. Her mother was wailing behind the curtain. I vomited in the stairwell. My knees buckled. I thought about quitting. But I didn't. 6 months in, you learn not to cry anymore. Not because you stop caring, but because if you cried for every loss, you wouldn't make it to morning rounds. You start compartmentalizing, drawing invisible lines between your hands and your heart. The residents had a saying, "Don't let it in or it'll never leave." But it always gets in. Eventually. The turning point for me was a shooting. 4 patients, same block. One kid, 15, had been shot in the neck. His friend was holding his shirt against the wound, blood soaking both of them. The boy's name was Corey. I'll never forget his eyes. He kept whispering, "Please, don't let me die." We intubated, rushed him to OR. I assisted. He coded on the table twice. I did compressions for 13 minutes straight. My arms were shaking. He survived. Paralyzed, but alive. 2 weeks later, I visited him in rehab. He looked at me and said, "You the lady who saved me?" I nodded. He smiled. That one smile kept me going for months. Around that time, I started working under Dr. Isaiah Vega, senior trauma surgeon. Cold, precise, brilliant, barely spoke, never panicked. Rumor was he once lost a mother and newborn in the same hour and hadn't smiled since. But he never missed, never flinched. One night, I watched him sew a kid's liver like it was silk, no wasted movement. I asked him how he stays so calm. He said, "I already lost the worst ones. Everything else is noise." I didn't understand that then, but I would. In 2011, I volunteered for the Joplin tornado relief. I thought I was tough by then. I wasn't. When I got there, it looked like the end of the world. No power, no clean water. Field hospitals were gymnasiums, filled with cots and screams. People wandered around bloodied, barefoot, stunned. Kids without parents, parents without kids. I worked 20-hour shifts, stitched wounds under flashlight, resuscitated people with garden hoses and duct tape. We ran out of morphine, used Tylenol and prayer. One woman gave birth on a cafeteria table. Her husband died shielding her in the storm. She didn't know it yet. I delivered her daughter, cleaned her with bottled water, told her the baby was beautiful. When I finally told her the truth, she didn't cry. She just stared out the window for a long time, then asked for his wedding ring. I stayed in Joplin for 12 days, slept maybe 8 hours, total. By the time I came back to Chicago, I felt like a ghost. Everything looked too clean, too easy. The hallway lights at the hospital buzzed too loud. I didn't speak to anyone for a week. But I went back to work because what else was I going to do? I started taking international disaster work because I couldn't shake the feeling that my own body didn't belong in peace anymore. In Haiti, I worked in a crushed clinic outside Port-au-Prince. We amputated limbs with saws from hardware stores. In Syria, I treated kids with bullet wounds from snipers. A 7-year-old died in my lap while his mother screamed in Arabic. I didn't know the words, but I understood. The worst thing about war zones is how normal they become after a while. You stop jumping at explosions, you start sleeping next to stacked bodies because there's nowhere else to lie down. Back home, I tried therapy. Once. The therapist asked me how I cope. I said, I sleep 4 hours a night and keep my scrubs by the door. She nodded and said we'd talk about boundaries. I never went back. In 2014, I was sent to Sierra Leone, Ebola. I've seen a lot of death, but nothing like that. Nothing like watching a child die while you stand outside the tent because you're not allowed to touch him. I held gloved hands through layers of plastic while people bled from their eyes. We wore triple-layer suits in 110-degree heat. I lost 7 pounds in 2 weeks. I stopped feeling human. One night, I watched my friend Maurice collapse during rounds. She'd hidden the fever for too long. She was gone in 3 days. When we buried her, we weren't allowed to say goodbye. The body was sealed, burned. When I came home after that, I didn't recognize myself. I couldn't eat indoors. I washed my hands 43 times a day. My hair started falling out. I slept with the lights on. But I still went back to the hospital because staying broken was easier than sitting still. Back at General, nothing had changed. More trauma, more night shifts, more silent deaths. A man came in with a heart attack, 38 years old, collapsed in his kitchen. I cracked his chest in the hallway because we didn't have time to reach the OR. He coded 3 times. We got him back. His wife hugged me like I'd saved the world. 3 days later, he stroked out and died. I couldn't even cry. I just nodded, said, okay, next. It's strange how a person can still move, still breathe, still speak, and yet be entirely gone inside. That's what I was in the years that followed. Gone. I kept showing up for shifts, kept responding to trauma codes, kept stitching open wounds and restarting stopped hearts. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped hoping, stopped asking myself why. I just performed, like a musician with no music left. Then came Ebola. Twice. 2015. The US was on edge. Hospitals scrambled. Protocols updated. PPE trainings became mandatory. I didn't tell anyone that I already knew what Ebola smelled like, what it did to people, what it felt like to burn under triple-layer suits and watch someone drown in their own blood. I started having panic attacks, quiet ones, on my way to work, in the stairwell, alone in the elevator, pressing my hands into my ribs just to feel something solid. But I kept showing up, because showing up was all I had left. By 2016, the hospital began bleeding staff, nurses quitting, young residents taking leave for mental clarity. I understood. I was just too numb to follow. The worst part wasn't the medicine. It was the paperwork. The systems. The fact that every patient's death came with 3 forms and a 14-minute conversation with risk management. That parents had to wait in a plastic chair outside while I told them their son didn't make it and then ask for ID to confirm. We lost a nurse that winter. Not to a patient, to herself. Quiet, reliable, soft-voiced Megan. Always stayed late, always brought snacks. One day, she clocked out, went home, and never came back. The note said, I can't carry all of this anymore. We didn't talk about it, just took shorter lunches and shifted her caseload to someone else. I started drinking again. Quietly. Alone. Not to escape, just to mute. And then came the virus that shattered the world. COVID-19. It arrived like a whisper and exploded like a grenade. The ER turned into a war zone in a week. Patients gasping, clutching their chests, dying before we could figure out how. We ran out of oxygen, ran out of beds, ran out of nurses, ran out of time. I didn't sleep for 31 days. I ran intubation teams, watched whole families arrive and disappear one by one. I called daughters, sons, husbands, told them we're doing everything we can. And when they died, I said, I'm so sorry, and meant it every time.
One night, I watched a priest read last rites to 7 patients in 1 hour. He had no voice left by the end, just tears behind his face shield. We started storing bodies in freezer trucks, started reusing masks, gowns, gloves. I wrote my name in marker on my N95 because I couldn't afford to lose it. A woman named Beatrice, 64, sweet, diabetic, terrified, held my hand through her intubation and said, "Please tell my daughter I love her." She died alone. I called her daughter. I didn't tell her everything, just that her mother was brave. My own body started giving up. I was running on fumes, literally. One day, I collapsed in the hallway. Dehydration, sleep deprivation, grief. The attending on call that night, a second year new to trauma, carried me into the break room and whispered, "Let us help you now." I started crying. Couldn't stop. First time in years. I was diagnosed with severe burnout and PTSD, put on leave. My license wasn't suspended, but I suspended myself. I went home, sat on my couch for hours each day, didn't turn on the news, didn't answer texts, just breathed, slowly, raggedly. That was the silence I never prepared for. But something changed during that time. Something cracked open. A box arrived one morning, no return address. Inside, a card and a photograph. The photo was of a young man in scrubs, graduation ceremony. The card said, "Dr. Hart, you probably don't remember me. I was your burn patient back in 2010. You stayed late every night. You told me I'd walk again. You were right. Now I want to be like you. Thank you for not giving up on me. Daniel S." I sat with that card in my lap for hours. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the names I forgot, the lives I couldn't save, the blood I'll never wash off. But it reminded me I did matter. Once. And maybe I still could. So I came back. But not to trauma, not to surgery. I came back to teach. I stood in front of a lecture hall filled with fresh, frightened faces. People who still believed they could save the world. And I told them the truth. Medicine will break you. It will hollow you out and fill you with silence. But sometimes, just sometimes, you'll be the only light in someone's darkest hour. And that light is enough. Now I teach compassion alongside technique. I teach memory alongside medicine. I tell my students about Samuel in Sierra Leone, about Corey in Chicago, about Maris, about Beatrice, about Megan. Because names matter, and stories matter. And if I forget them, who will remember? I don't work night shifts anymore, but I still wear scrubs, still carry a trauma kit in my car, still junk when I hear sirens. But I'm here. I stayed. That's what medicine is. Not glory, not healing, not power. It's staying. When the lights go out, when the hope runs dry, when everyone else walks away, you stay. Because someone has to.